For most Christians since the dawn of Christianity, reaching heaven has been the ultimate goal. According to St. Augustine, the Christian is a pilgrim on this earth. They are not of this world, but they do live in it for a time. Their true home, where they'll return once their pilgrimage is complete, is heaven, paradise. To complete the journey that is the Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri likewise brings his reader to heaven, though for him, and for us, it's not our permanent return, and he certainly recognized that not all of his readers would get to see it themselves, though he may have hoped that his work might help save some of them, just as Beatrice had done for him. Paradiso is a text full of philosophical and theological discussions as Dante makes his way toward paradise. But, as in the last two parts of the comedy, he inserts various historical figures with whom to have those discussions, and also as models for certain qualities. In this case, since we're going to heaven, generally positive ones. But Dante was writing for an early 14th century Christian intellectual audience, so a lot of the character references aren't super familiar for a modern audience reading the text some 700 years later. So, as I've done with the first two parts of the Divine Comedy, today I'm going to go over every single character who appears in Dante's Paradiso. For one final time, I'm going to go over my usual caveat. Firstly, this is the third video in a three-part series. You don't have to watch the other two to appreciate this one, but you may decide to do so, especially since I go over some concepts in them that may help you better understand this one. Second, as with the other two, I'm using the Durling and Martinez Oxford University Press translation of the comedy, and a good deal of my information is coming from their extensive notes, mainly when it comes to more obscure characters. Also, as previously, I'm going over characters who actually appear in the poem, not those who are only mentioned as references or in similes or whatever, because this video would be like 2 hours long otherwise. There will be some exceptions to this basically whenever I feel like it would make sense. Now, before we get into the poem, I also have to talk a little bit about medieval cosmology. Dante, like most intellectuals in the Middle Ages, followed a Ptolemaic view of the universe with a Christian twist. In this view, the Earth is at the center of the universe, composed of fire, water, earth, and air, and is surrounded by several concentric spheres, each of which holds a planet. In this view, there are 7 planets, those visible with the naked eye, all of which rotate around the Earth. In order from closest to furthest away, these are the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Beyond these, there's the sphere of the fixed stars, in contrast to the planets, which are moving stars, since they don't stay in the same place relative to all the other stars. Beyond that is a final sphere called the Primum Mobile, the first movable. In this view, all motion and change in the universe is caused by the motion of the Primum Mobile, which trickles down through the heavenly spheres and finally to Earth. Beyond that is the Empyrean, the highest heaven, where, for Christians, God, his angels, and the souls of the saved reside, though some of the angels are also turning the spheres. This ultimately is where Dante is headed, but he has to make his way through the lower heavens first. So let's head back down to Earth. When we last saw them, Dante and Beatrice were in the Garden of Eden, atop of the mountain of Purgatory. And since Purgatory allowed Dante's mind to be relieved of the weight of false thoughts and misplaced love, it's able to rise up into the sky. Beatrice and Dante arrive at the moon, entering into it. Here Dante sees images of several souls, like reflections in water droplets. The souls here are those who didn't fulfill the religious vows of obedience and chastity. The moon, because of its changing faces, was often associated with inconstance. The first soul he sees is Picarda Donati, sister of Forese Donati, Dante's friend who we met amongst the gluttons in Purgatory, which also makes her a cousin of Dante's wife, Gemma. Picarda and Forese were also the siblings of Corso Donati, who was still alive in 1300, the year the Divine Comedy takes place, and who was a Black Guelph leader who was instrumental in the coup which led to Dante's exile in 1302. And just a reminder, Dante's writing the comedy in the 1310s while in exile. I'm bringing Corso up here because he's relevant to his sister's presence in the moon. You see, Picarda joined the order of the Poor Clares, the female Franciscans, at a young age, taking a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the order. However, Corso later kidnapped her from the order and forced her to marry for the sake of a political alliance, which made it impossible to fulfill her vows. Although this situation wasn't really her fault, and indeed she's still in heaven, Beatrice notes that she should have tried to return to her order, even if doing so was a risk to her earthly well-being. Picarda then points to her companion, another woman who was in a similar situation, Constance d'Hauteville, the heiress to the kingdom of Sicily, who married the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI and gave birth to Frederick II, who we saw with the heretics in Inferno. According to a narrative popular in Dante's time, she had been a nun and was forced by Emperor Frederick Barbarossa to leave her convent and marry his son in order to prevent Sicily from going to her nephew Tancred of Lecce. However, in reality, she was never a nun and probably chose Henry as a husband in order to gain an upper hand against her nephew. Dante asks Picarda if she wishes she was higher in the heavenly hierarchy, but she notes that all in heaven are happy in their divinely ordered position. Harmony with the divine will is at the base of the divine love which makes heaven paradise, and it comes naturally as a result of purgation. Before we move on, Beatrice also notes that all the souls they're going to encounter are actually in the highest heaven. They're just appearing to Dante as he makes his way through the spheres. This isn't dismissing the concept of a divine hierarchy, though, since various souls participate in divine love to varying degrees. Regardless, Dante and Beatrice then ascend to Mercury. The souls here are those who sought glory, doing good, but neglecting the divinely focused contemplative life in favor of the worldly, active one. The souls here appear as shining lights, and this is generally the case for the souls in the rest of the poem, getting brighter and brighter as Dante approaches the highest heaven. One soul approaches and speaks to Dante, Justinian, a 6th century Eastern Roman emperor who's probably best known for building the modern Hagia Sophia and for his reconquests of Italy and North Africa, which had been ruled by Germanic kings for decades. Dante makes reference to his conversion from Monophysite Christianity, which is a fictional legend. He was always a Chalcedonian Christian, as well as his greatest legacy, at least for a medieval Latin European, his codification of Roman law, which had become the basis for much of the legal scholarship and doctrine of Dante's day. Parts of it even continue to be the basis for the civil law used in many places into the present, including in Quebec, where I'm from. Dante saw this law as divinely sanctioned, though Justinian was still overly focused on the glory and legacy of this world rather than the next. Justinian also mentions another soul there with him, Romeo de Villeneuve, a Catalan nobleman who served as a minister for the Count of Provence, Raymond Berengar V, and whose expert ministration of the realm was worthy of praise. Dante relates the myth that the Count was ungrateful and took advantage of Romeo, who wound up poor despite everything he did for his lord. But in reality, Romeo was rewarded handsomely and his achievements recognized. The myth of Raymond Berengar's ingratitude was likely invented by his enemies. Beatrice and Dante then ascend to Venus, where the souls are dancing around them in circles before coming to speak to Dante. Venus was connected to love, and so all the souls here are those of people who were known in life for their love, though now they redirect that love more properly towards God. First is Charles Martel, not the famous grandfather of Charlemagne, but another Charles Martel, the grandson of Charles of Anjou, who, as you may recall, took over the kingdom of Sicily/Naples. During the War of the Sicilian Vespers, when the actual island of Sicily fell to Aragon, Charles II, Charles Martel's father, was captured and Charles I died, leaving the teenage Charles Martel in charge alongside a regency council. Charles II was eventually released in 1289, but he then spent the next 5 years trying to negotiate a peace with Aragon, which kept him out of the kingdom, and Charles Martel wound up doing most of the ruling at home. The young prince was extremely popular and liked by everyone, including the popes, who declared him king of Hungary in 1290 after his uncle, the previous king, died, though he never actually managed to press his claim. And, tragically for the hopeful of the day, he died of an illness in 1295 at the age of only 23. The dialogue between the two makes it clear that Dante and Charles Martel knew one another, having in all likelihood met in 1294, when Charles II was on his way back to Naples after finally brokering a peace with Aragon. Charles Martel met up with his father in Florence, and there were 3 weeks of celebration there. As for his presence in Venus, Dante notes that Charles Martel was passionate, loving, and affectionate, which contributed greatly to his popularity. On top of that, Venus was also astrologically said to govern youth. Another soul who speaks there is Cunizza da Romano, sister to the infamous Ezzelino da Romano, who was one of the tyrants listed in Inferno. She was famous for her numerous love affairs and marriages in life. She was married to a lord of Verona, but was abducted at the behest of her brother by the troubadour Sordello, who we saw in Purgatory, and, as I mentioned there, it was widely believed that she and Sordello were lovers. Her brother then tried to use her as a political pawn, but she took another lover, the knight Enrico da Bogno, and traveled with him for several years. After Enrico's death, however, she returned to her brother and was married twice more. She was a woman guided by love, though now that love is properly guided toward God. Next up is a troubadour named Folquet de Marseille. He began his career writing poetry about his love for his lord's wife, but he would later become a Dominican friar and eventually Bishop of Toulouse. During his time as a cleric, he changed his tune, writing poems renouncing erotic love and instead directing his love toward God. He also preached against heresy and promoted the Albigensian Crusade, so that's fun. Finally, Folquet points to Rahab, our first biblical character. She was a prostitute from Jericho who helped Joshua conquer the city by hiding his spies in her home. Dante saw her faith in Joshua's mission to deliver Canaan to the Israelites as shifting her erotic love as a prostitute to a divine one, like with the others. With that, we move on to the sun, not only the largest object in the sky, but also the one with the most people to talk about, so go ahead and grab a snack. The souls here are wise teachers, and they appear in circles around Beatrice and Dante, singing as they circle them. The first to speak is Thomas Aquinas, arguably one of the most important philosophers and theologians of the Middle Ages. He was a Dominican friar who taught theology at several universities, most famously in Paris, and is best known for his Summa Theologica, a massive work that touches on pretty much every theological question you could think of. He was a defender of Aristotle and argued for the harmony of rational philosophy and divine revelation. Next to Aquinas is his teacher, Albertus Magnus, also Dominican, and likewise a man who was quite influential. He was very widely read and wrote on a huge variety of topics, including music, nature, commentaries on Aristotle, and theology, to just name a few. Aquinas then points out several of the souls in the ring around them. There's Gratian, who wrote the Decretum, the first attempt to codify canon law out of the various collections of canons from numerous church councils. Next is Peter Lombard, known for his Book of Sentences, a collection of pronouncements on theology by the Church Fathers, which became fundamental for the teaching of theology in medieval universities. After him, though not explicitly named, is King Solomon, the famously wise Israelite king who was believed to be the author of the biblical Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, the latter of which is a collection of wise teachings. He was also controversial, however, and some medieval theologians questioned or outright denied that he would be saved, though Dante clearly disagrees. Likewise unnamed is Pseudo-Dionysius, a 5th or 6th century Greek writer strongly influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy, whose most famous work, The Celestial Hierarchy, describes the hierarchy of angels, and had a huge impact on medieval views about angels, including Dante's own, as we'll see later. He's called Pseudo-Dionysius because he wrote under the name of, and was in Dante's time thought to actually be, Dionysius the Areopagite, a 1st century Athenian who was converted by St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. Dionysius was also thought to be Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris, but this was later realized to be impossible since Saint Denis lived in the 3rd century. Next up, again unnamed, is Orosius, a late antique historian who was prompted by St. Augustine to write the History Against the Pagans, a history meant to counter contemporary pagan claims that everything had gone downhill since Christianity had become the official religion of Rome. This work was one of the main sources for many medieval people's knowledge of ancient history. After him, once again unnamed, is Boethius, a Roman counselor to the Ostrogothic king Theodoric, who was eventually imprisoned on suspicion of treachery. Boethius is best known for his Consolation of Philosophy, an extremely popular work in the Middle Ages that teaches about how all worldly goods are subject to the whims of fortune and can always be taken away, and therefore one must find joy not in those fleeting things, but in the highest good, God. Next, Aquinas quickly names 3 men in a row: Isidore of Seville, Bede, and Richard of Saint Victor. Isidore was a bishop in Visigothic Spain who wrote several works compiling and transmitting classical knowledge, most famously his encyclopedia known as the Etymologies. Bede was an Anglo-Saxon monk, today best known for his Ecclesiastical History of the English People, our main source for early Anglo-Saxon history. But Dante probably has him here for his biblical commentaries and his Computus for calculating the date of Easter. Richard was a Scottish Augustinian prior who wrote on mystical theology and contemplation, and was rather influential in that field. Finishing off this ring of souls, Aquinas then points out Siger of Brabant, a highly controversial supporter of the philosophy of Averroes, who was labeled a heretic because of it. Despite Aquinas' praising of Siger here, he was opposed to him in life, especially the Averroist doctrine of the unity of intellect, which argued that all humans shared the same intellect, though Siger did change some of his ideas later in life. Nonetheless, this idea seems to have inspired Dante in his arguments about the need for human political unity to reach their shared goals of peace and happiness. After that, another circle of souls arrives, and here it's the Franciscan theologian Bonaventure who speaks and points them out to Dante. Bonaventure was also a prolific writer who taught theology at Paris alongside Aquinas. His most famous work, The Journey of the Mind to God, had a very clear influence on Dante's narrative for Paradiso. The first two Bonaventure point out are Illuminatus and Agostino, two of the first followers of St. Francis, who we'll get to later. Having devoted themselves to lives of faith and poverty, they teach more through the commendable examples of their lives than through their writings like the others in this sphere. Next up are Hugh of Saint Victor, another teacher of theology, whose Didascalion became an important introduction to theology and philosophy, Peter Comestor, another teacher best known for his Historia Scholastica, a book of biblical history, and Peter of Spain, known for his Tractatus, a book on Aristotelian logic, who may also have been Pope John the 21st, but this isn't entirely agreed upon. Bonaventure then points out the Old Testament prophet Nathan, who prophesied that the house of David would rule eternally, which Christians saw as a reference to Christ, since Jesus is traditionally said to be a descendant of David's. He is, therefore, the first teacher of the coming of Christ. Next are John Chrysostom, a church father and patriarch of Constantinople, who was known for his preaching and whose writings would have a big influence on later Christianity, Anselm of Canterbury, perhaps best known for his Cur Deus Homo, or Why God Became Man, which used rational arguments to explain God's incarnation as Jesus to redeem humanity, Aelius Donatus, a rhetorician and grammarian who wrote an important Latin grammar, Rabanus Maurus, abbot of Fulda and eventually Archbishop of Mainz, known for his encyclopedic works, and finally Joachim da Fiore, an abbot and influential, if controversial, writer who criticized both the Church and the Holy Roman Empire, foreseeing the coming of a new age of renewal after this present one of corruption, which had a big impact on Dante. After this, there's a third ring of souls, but none of them are identified, and Dante and Beatrice continue on into the next sphere, Mars. Mars was astrologically associated with war, and so the souls here are all those who fought for the faith. They appear in the form of a cross, and down from the cross comes the first soul, Cacciaguida, Dante's great-great-grandfather. He'd become a knight under the king of the Romans, Conrad III, presumably when Conrad came to Milan to be crowned king of Italy in 1128. Side note, like with Rudolf I in Purgatorio, Dante calls Conrad emperor even though he was never crowned as such and never used that title. Cacciaguida then served Conrad in his conflicts with other German contenders for the Roman crown, which are often seen as the First Guelph-Ghibelline Wars, though at this point they were mostly confined north of the Alps. Anyway, the reason Cacciaguida is here, though, is because he also followed Conrad during the Second Crusade, where he died in battle during one of Conrad's several military defeats. To die fighting in a crusade made one a martyr in the eyes of most people at the time, including Dante. Cacciaguida then talks about corruption in Dante's Florence, contrasting it to the good old days when he was alive. More evidence that no matter how far back you go, people have always been complaining that things aren't as good as they used to be. After which he names several other warriors of God who are part of the cross. First up are two Old Testament figures, starting with Joshua, the leader of the Israelites after Moses, who was tasked by God with the conquest of Canaan for God's chosen people. Next is the Great Maccabee, i.e. Judas Maccabee, who led the Maccabean revolt against the Greek Seleucids in response to their attempts to Hellenize the Judeans, which the rebels saw as a desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem with pagan idols and sacrifices. The rest are figures who fought against Muslims, starting with Charlemagne and Roland. Charlemagne was king of the Franks and the first Holy Roman Emperor, while Roland was one of his vassals as lord of the Breton March. Dante's inclusion of them here is because of the famous 11th century poem called the Chanson de Roland, or Song of Roland, where Roland is killed by ambushing Muslim forces during the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, which in real life was against Basques, not Muslims. This song is one of the earliest of a larger genre of chansons de geste, one cycle of which followed the adventures of Charlemagne and his paladins, of whom Roland was usually the leader. Similarly, the next two are William and Renoir. William is William of Orange, a count of Toulouse and a vassal of Charlemagne like Roland. He was a commander of the Frankish army which captured Barcelona from the Muslim Umayyads in 801. He was also the main character in several other chansons de geste, where he likewise fought against Muslims. Renoir is a fictional character from one of those chansons called Aliscans, though Dante may have believed him to be real. In the story, he is a giant son of a Muslim king who was captured as a boy and made a kitchen slave. He's eventually converted to Christianity and recruited by William, helping him win a battle over the forces of Renoir's own father. Next up is Godfrey of Bouillon, a leader of the First Crusade who became the first king of Jerusalem after the capture of that city and his victory at Ascalon in 1099, though he died just under a year later. And finally, there's Robert Guiscard, a Norman leader in southern Italy who was granted rule over Sicily by the Pope and captured it from the Muslims ruling there in the 1060s, eventually leading to the foundation of the Kingdom of Sicily under his brother's descendants. He also conquered parts of southern Italy ruled by the Byzantine Empire, but Dante's probably more focused on his war against Muslims. With that, Dante and Beatrice move on to the next sphere, Jupiter. Here the souls appear in the shape of an eagle, representing rulership and justice. The eagle itself is the one to speak here, condemning several unjust kings who were still alive in 1300, including Philip IV of France, Edward Longshanks of England, Robert the Bruce of Scotland, and a bunch of others that I'm not going to go over. As for the souls, they're those of just rulers, and the eagle specifically points out those making up its eye. Its pupil is King David, the most famous Israelite king, attributed as author of the Psalms, for which Dante calls him the singer of the Holy Spirit, who is renowned for his justice in his judgment over the Israelites. Making up the rest of the eye are more souls, including Hezekiah, a descendant of David as king of Judah, who was also known for his justice, and who God granted an extra 15 years of life after his imminent death was prophesied. There's also Constantine the Great, the first Christian Roman emperor who also founded the city of Constantinople. Dante makes reference to his supposed donation of the Western Roman Empire to the papacy after Pope Sylvester I baptized him and cured his leprosy. This so-called donation of Constantine was used to justify the Pope's temporal rule and meddling in the succession and politics of Catholic kingdoms, though it was later discovered to be a fake document from the 8th century, probably to justify the Pope's deposition of the Merovingian dynasty in Francia and coronation of Charlemagne's father Pippin. In any case, this wasn't discovered until the Renaissance, and Dante believed it to be real and a horrible mistake, something which Constantine now realizes in death, though Dante is clear to make note that its good intentions didn't diminish Constantine's justice. Next up is William II of Sicily, whose rule was a moment of stability between that of his father, William I, and the time after his death without any children, which led to the conflict between Constance d'Hauteville, his aunt, who we saw earlier in the Moon, and Tancred, his cousin. This conflict also brought Sicily more deeply into the Guelph-Ghibelline struggles in Italy. Finally, there are two rulers who may seem a little surprising to find in heaven: the Roman Emperor Trajan and the Trojan warrior Ripheus. Let's start with Ripheus. He was a character mentioned by Virgil in the Aeneid who died defending Troy from the Greeks. Virgil describes him as being the most just of the Trojans, but of course he wasn't a Christian, nor a Hebrew. So how is he in heaven? Dante actually has the same question, and the eagle explains that his justice was so great that God, through his grace, revealed the future incarnation of Christ to him, which Ripheus accepted, and he was therefore brought to heaven alongside the good Hebrews during the harrowing of hell, when Jesus came down after his crucifixion to save those who held the old covenant with God. If you remember Cato the Younger from Purgatorio, this is pretty much the same situation, though Dante here is more explicit about it. The situation with Trajan is a little different, though. Trajan was emperor in the 2nd century, after the Incarnation. But there was a popular legend in the Middle Ages which explains why he's here. Trajan was considered a very good emperor, sometimes the best emperor, optimus princeps. He was popular with everyone. He even got a reputation as good towards Christians, based on a famous letter between him and Pliny the Younger when Pliny was governing Bithynia and Pontus, where he basically just told Pliny not to persecute Christians unless they were causing actual problems. This reputation is probably what led to a legend about him where he put the preparations for his Dacian campaign on hold in order to personally help a desperate widow obtain justice against her son's killer. This led to a later medieval legend that Pope Gregory the Great, in the 6th century, learned about this great act of justice and prayed to God for Trajan's release from hell. Because of this, Trajan was momentarily brought back to life, just long enough for him to profess his faith in Christ and gain access to heaven. Fun fact, this legend is the whole reason why I made this series in the first place. I originally just wanted to make a video about why Dante puts Trajan in heaven, and then I thought, why not make a video about why he puts anyone anywhere? And then it turned into 3 videos when I started to reread the Comedy and remembered just how many characters are actually in it. But anyway, that brings us to the end of Jupiter, and so we move on to the final planet, Saturn. Here Dante sees a golden ladder leading high up into heaven, based on the ladder from Jacob's dream in Genesis. There are several lights moving up and down it, and one of them comes to approach Dante. The souls here are those who led lives of religious contemplation, and this light is the soul of Peter Damian, an 11th century monk and occasionally hermit of Fonte Avellana, who reluctantly became a cardinal in 1043. He was known for his extensive writings calling for reform, denouncing the sins of clergymen, and promoting an ascetic lifestyle. His works played an important part in the 11th century Gregorian reforms, and, surprise, surprise, Dante has him trash-talk the clergy of his own day as well. A bunch more spheres of light then come to join them, and one of them begins to speak, Benedict of Nursia. Saint Benedict was the founder of the famous monastery of Monte Cassino, for which he wrote his equally famous rule which dictated how the monastery's monks would live their lives. The Rule of Benedict would become one of the most influential monastic rules in the Latin West, and most monasteries would come to adopt the rule or some variation of it. Benedict represents the cenobitic or communal lifestyle. His monks lived in organized communities. But he then points out 2 others who represent the eremitic or solitary life of contemplation. The first is Macarius, who's probably one of 2 early Egyptian desert hermits, or a conflation of both. Macarius the Ancient, who settled in the desert near Thebes, or Macarius of Alexandria, who did so in the desert south of Alexandria. The second soul is Saint Romuald, an Italian traveling hermit who inspired many, including Peter Damian, and helped bring about the 11th century revival in eremitic monasticism, centered on small communities of hermits who lived in individual cells but came together for liturgical service and communal meals. Dante then climbs the golden ladder to the sphere of the fixed stars. He witnesses several souls in a triumphal procession, reenacting the Annunciation, Crucifixion, and Resurrection of Christ. One of the lights, at the center of the procession, is bright and blinding, and Beatrice confirms that this is actually God the Son, Christ himself. And since Dante is a Trinitarian Christian, it's probably about time I finally talk about Jesus. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone watching this knows who Jesus is, but I did say I was going to talk about every character who appears in the comedy, so here we go. Jesus of Nazareth was a 1st century Jew from Galilee, which at the time was a protectorate of the Roman Empire. According to Christian belief, he was the Son of God, born from a virgin mother, and according to Trinitarian Christians, he was himself also God, God the Son, one of the three persons of the Holy Trinity, along with God the Father and the Holy Spirit. Probably in his 30s, Jesus started preaching and gained several followers in Galilee who came to believe that he was the Messiah, the prophesied Savior of the Israelites. Messiah means anointed one in Hebrew, in reference to the anointing of kings and high priests with oil. In Greek, this translates to Christos, which is where the title Christ comes from. Jesus and his followers eventually came to Jerusalem for Passover, an important time of great religious fervor for Jews, and Jesus was no exception. He caused a major ruckus by criticizing the high priesthood and arguing with religious experts, which ultimately led them to condemn him and ask the Roman authorities to have him executed, which they did via crucifixion. According to Christians, he then came back to life 3 days later and returned in the flesh to heaven, his sacrifice by crucifixion having saved humanity from the original sin of Adam and created a way for humans to reach heaven. But anyway, back to the procession. As it left, a few souls stayed behind, one of which comes up to Dante. This is Saint Peter, also known as Simon or Simon Peter. He was one of Christ's apostles who became the first bishop of Rome, the first pope, who Jesus granted the keys to the kingdom of heaven, calling him the rock upon which he would build his church. This was the basis for which popes, the successors of Peter as bishops of Rome, claimed their authority over the whole church. Peter was also thought in Dante's day to represent the virtue of faith, and so Peter questions Dante about his faith and is satisfied with the answer. Then comes James the Elder, another of Christ's apostles. James was the son of Salome, who is traditionally thought to be the sister of Mary, making him Jesus' cousin. Dante refers to him through a reference to his popular pilgrimage site in Spain, Santiago de Compostela, where his remains are believed to be buried. James represents the virtue of hope, and so he asks Dante to describe what hope promises him. He too was satisfied by Dante's answer. Finally, a third apostle comes, John the Evangelist, James's brother. John was thought to be especially loved by Jesus, and Dante refers to him by his reclining on Jesus during the Last Supper, and Jesus' request to him to take care of his mother, John's aunt, while hanging on the cross. John, James, and Peter were often considered to be the most trusted and important of the apostles, which is why the three of them are together here. And Jesus' love for John led him to represent the virtue of charity, or love of God. John asks Dante to profess this love, which he does, and John is satisfied. Dante then notices a fourth soul, which Beatrice reveals to be Adam, the first man created by God in the Garden of Eden, father to all humanity, whose pride led him to disobey God's command not to eat of the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This disobedience led to the fall of man and original sin, which was inherited by all of humanity thereafter, and can only be cleansed through baptism after Christ's crucifixion. After that, Dante and Beatrice ascend to the Primum Mobile, where Dante sees a vision of 9 circles spinning around a central point. Beatrice explains that these are the 9 grades of angels, following the celestial hierarchy of Pseudo-Dionysius, who I mentioned earlier back in the sun. From highest to lowest, these are seraphim, cherubim, and thrones in the first triad, dominions, virtues, and powers in the second, and principalities, archangels, and angels in the third triad. By the way, when you see people pointing out supposed UFOs in medieval and Renaissance art, that's actually these circling angels, not a flying saucer. Other than that, there's no actual characters in this sphere. Finally, Beatrice and Dante reach the final and highest heaven, the heaven of pure light, the Empyrean. Here Dante sees a great heavenly court, with the souls in heaven seated in what he describes as a rose, which is like a massive amphitheater with thousands of tiers of seats. Around it, angels fly like bees. Beatrice points to one empty throne and says that it will be the place of Henry VII, Henry of Luxembourg, elected King of the Romans in 1308 and crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1312, the first to actually hold the title since Frederick II's death in 1250. Many were enthusiastic about Henry, and Dante saw him as a potential restorer of proper imperial authority and a bringer of peace to the world. This was in part because Henry was indifferent to the factionalism in Italy, demanding that all cities allow all political exiles to return, regardless of whether they were Guelphs, the pro-papal faction, or Ghibellines, the pro-imperial, and tried to avoid favoritism. However, factionalism would play out regardless, especially since Henry insisted on restoring imperial law and authority in Italy, which led to many Guelph cities, including Florence, resisting him, and although Pope Clement V initially accepted his coronation as emperor, he ultimately resisted him from his new court in Avignon, while Henry was crowned in Rome by Ghibelline cardinals instead. Despite this, Dante still saw him as a divinely sanctioned restorer, and blamed the Italians for not being ready to accept him. Henry's ambitions went incomplete when he died of illness in 1313, during his attempt to subdue Tuscany. Beatrice then returns to her own seat and is replaced as Dante's guide by Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian monk of Citeaux who spread its traditionalist Benedictine approach and mystical spirituality by founding several new Cistercian abbeys. He was also a famed writer and an eloquent preacher, having famously preached the Second Crusade. Bernard points out the structure of the rose and several of the souls seated in it. At the very top sits the Queen of Heaven, Mary. Mary was the mother of Jesus, and thus the mother of God, who was highly revered, and continues to be for Catholics and many other Christians, as the most holy of all saints. It was her perfection which led God to choose her as his mother, with a popular tradition emerging in the Middle Ages that she was also born to her parents without sexual intercourse, making her even free of original sin which was passed down through sexual relations, a doctrine known as the Immaculate Conception. Below Mary are various other women. Directly below her is Eve, the first woman and mother to all, who was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and was convinced by a serpent to commit the original sin by eating of the forbidden fruit. Nonetheless, she was freed of her sin alongside Adam by Christ's crucifixion due to her faith in God. Below Eve is Rachel, the wife of Jacob and the sister of Leah, who Dante saw in his dream in Purgatory. If you recall, there I noted how Leah was seen in the Middle Ages as a symbol of the divinely active life. Rachel is here as a symbol of the contemplative. Next to her is where Beatrice is sitting, who serves as a symbol of Dante's own divine contemplation. Rachel's place beneath Eve, and Eve's beneath Mary, is also symbolic, being the mother of God, the mother of humanity, and the mother of the tribes of Israel. Continuing beneath Rachel, Bernard points out Sarah, Abraham's wife and mother of Isaac, known for her piety. Then Rebekah, Isaac's wife and the mother of Jacob, said to be kind and generous. Both of these women are also matriarchs of the Hebrews. Next is Judith, a Hebrew woman who seduced and beheaded the Assyrian general Holofernes, who I mentioned in Purgatorio amongst the negative examples of pride. And finally there's Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David, also known for her kindness, who's likely here especially to represent the lineage of Jesus through David, as represented in the Gospel of Matthew. Below her, Bernard notes that there are many other virtuous women, seated on one side of the line below Mary or the other, depending on whether they lived before or after the resurrection of Christ. Opposite Mary on the other side of the rose is John the Baptist, another popular religious preacher from the 1st century with a following, who baptized Jesus and who, according to Christian tradition, anticipated his arrival as the Messiah. Below him are Saints Francis, Benedict, and Augustine. Francis of Assisi was the son of a wealthy merchant who grew up in a life of luxury, but eventually became disillusioned and devoted himself instead to a life of absolute poverty and simplicity, preaching and performing charity, and attracting followers, which would lead to the creation of the Franciscan order of friars. Benedict we've already seen, and Augustine was a Roman North African bishop, often considered the last of the Church Fathers, whose writings, especially his City of God and Confessions, would have a huge impact on Western Christianity. What unites these three is their rules. Benedict's we've already mentioned, while Francis wrote a rule for the Franciscans, and Augustine wrote a letter to his sister, who was the head of a group of nuns, giving them advice on how to live a religious life, which, in combination with some of his sermons and other writings, were used as the basis of rules for several communities and orders starting especially in the 12th century, including the Dominicans. They're also connected to John the Baptist because he lived an austere life in the desert. Bernard then points out a bunch of children in the lower parts of the rose who were saved not by their own merits, since they're too young to really act virtuously, but by those of their parents, who had them baptized or circumcised or just held the faith, depending on the era. Dante then looks back to Mary and sees the archangel Gabriel spreading his wings in reference to the Annunciation, when Gabriel announced to Mary that she was pregnant with God's child. Like most named angels in the Bible, his role is mainly as a messenger of God, though he's also noted as being the guardian of the Israelites. Back to the rows, however, we see on either side of Mary Adam, father of man, and Peter, father of the church, both of whom we've already mentioned. Next to Peter is John the Evangelist, again already mentioned, and next to Adam is Moses, the main leader of the Hebrews in the biblical book of Exodus, who led the Hebrews out of slavery in Egypt and obtained the law tablets from God on Mount Sinai containing the 10 Commandments. Opposite Peter and next to John the Baptist is Anna, Mary's mother, who's gazing lovingly at her daughter from the other side of the rows. On the other side of John the Baptist and opposite Adam is Saint Lucy, a 3rd century virgin martyr from Syracuse, that's Sicily, not New York, who was Dante's patron. Mary, fearing for Dante, had sent Lucy to send Beatrice to send Virgil to bring him on this journey of personal reformation. She also carried him in his sleep to the gates of purgatory, as you may remember. After that, Bernard directs Dante's gaze towards God, praying to Mary to assist him in being able to see into the light. Dante looks into it, and with divine assistance, he comes to truly understand the mysteries of God, though he notes that they're impossible to describe with the limits of human language and mind. In that moment, his soul is moved and aligned with the eternal divine love, and the comedy comes to an end. Dante fulfills the desires of any mystic, but for the reader to experience it for themselves, they will have to make their own journey. And with Dante's conclusion to his Divine Comedy, so too comes the conclusion to this video and this series. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something interesting, whether about any of the characters and their backgrounds or anything else. Again, I didn't talk about many of the more philosophical or theological topics in the poem, which are quite interesting in their own right, but hey, this video is plenty long enough as it is. As always, I thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.